Thanks for listening to Brand New Again. As always, Pastor Bill Ritchie is our teacher, the founding pastor of Crossroads Community Church in Vancouver, Washington. And I'm Ron Hagelgans. Glad you're listening as we once again open up the radio ministry archives and bring you an 8-part series called If Only I Had from 1992. We're presenting each of these sermons start to finish so you can get the complete original context, and you'll find the specific dates and information in the description. And as you listen, remember that culture was very different back then on many levels, but we're so thankful that God's truth never changes. So please get out your Bible, and here's Pastor Bill.
Open your Bibles to 2 Samuel 15. 2 Samuel 15. The way I always remembered these was they're in reverse alphabetical orders. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Just one of those little tidbits I'd throw in for what it was worth. Might not be worth much for you. It helped me whenever I learned those things. 2 Samuel 15, one little verse, 13th verse says, "And a messenger came to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." Everybody has tough times. There's nobody in his life who is able to avoid them. In fact, it's very possible that right now you are right in the middle of one of those very things. And so what we're talking about is sort of hitting you right where you live. As I thought about that reality, I was reminded of a story that I read quite some time ago. It was about a fellow who was writing back to his insurance company because they had sent his claim back because they couldn't understand what in the world he was talking about, because he had reported so many injuries, kind of diverse injuries, and hadn't really explained himself very well, that they said, listen, if we're going to pay this thing, you've got to clarify what in the world really happened. And so he wrote them back a letter. He said, I'm writing in response to your request concerning block number 1 on the insurance form, which asked for the cause of injuries, wherein I put trying to do the job alone. You said you needed more information, so I trust the following will be sufficient. I'm a bricklayer by trade, and on the day of injuries, I was working alone, laying brick around the top of a 4-story building, when I realized that I had about 500 pounds of bricks left over. Rather than carry the bricks down by hand, I decided to put them in a barrel and lower them by pulley, which was fastened to the top of the building. I secured the end of the rope at ground level, went up to the top of the building, loaded the bricks into the barrel, and flung the barrel out with the bricks in it. Then I went down, untied the rope, holding it securely to ensure the slow descent of the barrel. As you will note in block number 6 of the insurance form, I weigh 150 pounds. Due to the shock of being jerked off the ground so swiftly, I lost my presence of mind and forgot to let go of the rope. Between the 2nd and 3rd floors, I met the barrel coming down. This accounts for the bruises and lacerations on my upper body. Regaining my presence of mind, again I held tightly to the rope and proceeded rapidly up the side of the building, not stopping until my right hand was jammed in the pulley. This accounts for my broken thumb. Despite the pain, I retained my presence of mind, held tightly to the rope. At approximately the same time, however, the barrel of bricks hit the ground, and now the bottom fell out of the barrel. Devoid of the weight of the bricks, the barrel was now lighter than I. I refer you again to block number 6 and my weight. As you would guess, I began a rapid descent. In the vicinity of the 2nd floor, I met the barrel coming up. This explains the injuries to my lower legs and lower body. Slowed only slightly, I continued my descent, landing on the pile of bricks. Fortunately, my back was only sprained and the internal injuries were minimal. I'm sorry to report, however, that at this point I again lost my presence of mind and let go of the rope. As you can imagine, the empty barrel crashed down on me. I trust this answers your concerns. Your trials might not be quite as complex as this guy's. But I guarantee you, if you are alive, you have trials. You may not be facing them just at this moment, but I'll bet you just went through some. Or if you didn't just go through some and aren't facing them right now, hold on to your seat. You got some coming. Because the truth is, everybody who is alive faces difficulties in his or her life, and you know what that's like. Maybe, for instance, you have made some major purchases. You bought a house, or you bought a car, or a boat, or new furniture, or some other such thing, and suddenly you found out you were laid off from your job. You didn't even get a chance really to prepare for this, and boom, your whole future just kind of disintegrated right before your very eyes, and you're not quite sure how you're going to deal with this. Or maybe some years ago, you entered into a marriage with the assumption that you were going to live happily ever after. Only it didn't work like that, and it fell apart. And for some time now, you've been trying to pick up the pieces to figure out how in the world you're going to make sense out of life, the way it's lived. Maybe you made a really bad decision and therefore got involved in some kind of a problem that has brought guilt to your remembrance for years. And you just can't break free from that, and it seems that impinges on everything you think, everything you do. I don't know what your struggles are. Maybe you just have the plain, ordinary, plain vanilla, run-of-the-mill, everyday hassles in life. But I guarantee you that everybody goes through trials, without exception. Now, when you're faced by your trials, at least my experience is, it is very easy to be overwhelmed by them. I can remember, for instance, just after we had finished graduate school, and that was a rather long haul, and it does tend to deplete your resources so that all you have staring you in the face is loans or whatever. And we were in the first church that we were serving on relatively meager resources, to say the least. We were eating on a card table. I'm sure many of you have shared this experience before. You didn't have enough money to get any furniture or anything. And the tires on our car just kind of got worn down to the cords, and we had no choice but to buy 2 new tires. Now, that was no big deal, buying those 2 new tires, except in order to buy those 2 new tires took every cent we had in the world. I mean, we drained every account we ever thought of having. And at least as the provider in that particular relationship, I really just about panicked. Because I thought to myself, what in the world if something happens? What am I going to do? What are we going to do? And I found it difficult not to be consumed by that particular trial. It's very easy to be overwhelmed by your trials. And when you're overwhelmed by your trials, at least for me, I find it at that point awfully easy to spend all my time just cursing the enemy. You know, how in the world, who do you think you are to come into my life and do these things to me? While it is true that the enemy may very well be responsible for my problems, the more time I spend cursing the enemy, the less time I spend looking to the Lord. And the less time I spend looking to the Lord, the less I am sensitive to His presence and His power and His provision in my life. And yet that seems to be just kind of the way it works. You face a problem, you get into a problem, you get overwhelmed by that problem. If ever you have experienced this before, or if you find yourself in the middle of this right now, I have what I consider to be some tremendous news for you from the Word. And that is simply this: God gives to His people some of His greatest treasures right in the middle of their toughest trials. But you've got to look to Him and you've got to trust Him if you're going to be able to experience the gift of those treasures in your life. Now, there's a story in the Bible that illustrates this as well as any that I know. And God really gives His treasure through a relatively unknown character named Ittai. And that's the story that is developed in 2 Samuel. While the main character of the story is David, as a matter of fact, it is Ittai through whom God brings the treasure that He wants in David's life. Now, you'll find this story discussed in the book of 2 Samuel, and really at your leisure, when you have the time, I would commend to you that you would read 2 Samuel chapters 11 through 17 or 18 to the end of the story. So you can see how the entire thing developed, because it's just a glorious story to read. There are so many things that are in it, are so rich for today. But let me just kind of go back and present for you kind of a bird's eye view, an overview of what it was that was going on, so you can see how God expressed this truth in David's life. I think that for most of us, we fail to remember that there was a time in David's life when he felt like everything had fallen apart for him, that the wheels just kind of came off of his life, and he was somehow moving out of control, that he wasn't able to handle what it was that popped up before him. He was hit by a trial, as a matter of fact, so hard that it would not only have rocked lesser men, it would have wiped them out. And I suspect that if you or I would have been hit by something like this, we would simply not have been able to withstand this kind of attack, the heat of the battle, the struggle that took place. Let's go back in his life. You know, even as a young man, we know that David had struggles. He had to fight against wild beasts when he was a shepherd, and he prevailed, or God prevailed through him, gave him strength to be able to prevail. We know that as a young man, again, he fought the giant Goliath, a huge, strapping man, you know, bigger than Jabbar or Akim or anybody else, a huge, huge man. And he prevailed against him. We know that he was chased unmercifully by King Saul, and he was able to elude him until finally he prevailed over him. We know that through the years, as he was reigning as king of God's people, time and again, he was assaulted, he was attacked by enemies, and time and again, God was able somehow to establish his victory in David's life. But at the very height of his life and of his career, David fell into sin. Now you must understand, David was a good guy. He didn't have some kind of mega sleaze factor just underneath the surface, you know, just waiting to erupt, that he was able somehow to hide all the time so that nobody could see what a creep he really was. He was a good guy. He was a guy who was really devoted to the Lord. The Word tells us that he had a heart after God, that his heart was just totally committed to the Lord. But he came to a point in his life in which he just kind of relaxed. When he was just at the height of his career. There's nothing wrong with relaxation, but in his case, he allowed that relaxation also to be relaxing in his faith. Relaxing in being sensitive to what it means to be single-hearted for God. What it means to have all of your life conform to the Lord and to the Lord's life and to the Lord's expectations and so on. He just kind of relaxed at that point. And before he even really thought about what was happening, he allowed himself to get caught up in some feelings that he had and to flow with those feelings. And the upshot was he ended up not only being involved in adultery, but in murder as well. It was just awful. I mean, one thing led to another, and as he tried to cover up one problem, he compounded it with another problem, and things just got worse and worse. Well, in the middle of all that, the Lord came to him through a prophet whose name was Nathan. And he addressed him with the reality of his problems, just hit him smack in the face with those problems. And when he saw himself face to face, David immediately repented. He felt terrible. He felt awful for what it was that he had done. And he asked the Lord's forgiveness, and God forgave him. But even though God forgave him, there were some sort of natural consequences of what he had been involved in that were going to catch up with him. And it was going to be a difficult time that he was just going to have to go through. In fact, you'll read about that in the 12th chapter of 2 Samuel, as Nathan just kind of spells out the things that he's going to have to deal with. It wasn't going to happen in the next day. It wasn't going to happen in the next week. It wasn't going to happen necessarily in the next year, but it was going to happen. And so David, you can imagine, inside was sort of living with the sense that the other shoe was going to drop at some point, not knowing exactly how or where or what, but being faithful to the Lord, and the Lord was absolutely faithful to him. Well, the way in which this difficulty emerged was then through a son of his named Absalom. Absalom himself had been involved in all kinds of problems, had killed one of his brothers or half-brothers, another of his half-brothers, and had fled from David's presence and had hung out away from David for a long season. Finally, David extended forgiveness to him, and he was able to come back into the kingdom. And even though he was guilty of horrible problems, David said that he would be allowed to live out his life there and everything would be wonderful. But what David didn't understand was that Absalom had something else on his mind. What Absalom really coveted was the kingdom. What he wanted was David's spot. He wanted control. He wanted the whole thing. He wasn't willing to just be the son with an inheritance. He wanted everything, and he wanted it now. And so Absalom started a very methodical process of taking over the kingdom, and David knew absolutely nothing about it. You've got to understand this about Absalom. He was an incredibly good-looking character. The Bible tells us that he was without blemish. He was tall. He was a big, strapping kind of a man. His hair was so thick. The Bible tells us that at the end of the year, when he got his hair cut, it weighed 5 pounds. Think about that. I mean, this guy was amazing. He was the kind of person who just came off as a really neat person. Not because he had substance, not because you knew where he really was, but he just had this charm and charisma that whatever he said seemed to be right. And so he started the process of undermining David's kingdom. And he did it like this. He would sit outside the gates as people would come into the kingdom to be able to talk to David and their advisors about their problems. And he would sort of snag them as they came in and say, you know, the reality is you're not going to be able to get to David. I mean, he's so busy. There are so many people on his schedule. There's no way you're going to get to him. And to be honest with you, he really doesn't care about your problems. I mean, he's so caught up in this big kingdom, all this stuff that he has going. He doesn't care about the likes of you. You're just a peon to him. You're nothing. He wouldn't even know you were. He wouldn't even know your name. All he's interested in is somehow the taxes that you can give to help this kingdom out. But he really doesn't care about you as a person. Now, you know, if I were king, things would be different because I really do care about you. In fact, you know, you can just trust me to meet your needs. If there's anything I'd want to be able to do, it's to meet your needs. And you know that. Well, these people, as they were standing there, just kind of gaga with this big, good-looking guy looking at him, saying these wonderful things, thought, well, gee, this is really true. And Absalom said, and as a matter of fact, you know, as I create my camp, I think it would really be nice if you just came and were a part of my camp. Because my camp is going to be a great camp, and we're really going to grow, and we're going to take over, and all these things are going to happen. The people weren't very discerning. And they got caught up for the moment in the charisma of Absalom because it sounded so good. They didn't understand his heart. They didn't understand what was really behind it all. They completely lost sight of the secure place that David had created for them. They didn't look to the fruit of Absalom's life. They didn't look to see what had happened in times past. They just kind of took him at his word at the moment, didn't bother to check anything about. Didn't go to David and say, are these things really true? Do you really not care about me? Do you not? I mean, none of that ever transpired. They were just sort of mesmerized by Absalom at that moment, and they began to drift away from David with him, forgetting everything else that had gone on. They made some sort of tentative commitments to go ahead and be a part of Absalom's thing. Well, David was just unaware of all of this. He continued to just do his kingly thing, kinging around each day. Whatever you do as a king, he did that. And he just trusted that everything was going fine. He had a great relationship with his people. The whole kingdom was exceedingly stable. I mean, across the years, he had built this to be a very strong thing. There was no question about that. And so he assumed, unfortunately, that everything was just going fine. And in the meantime, person by person, Absalom would begin to snag these people, to draw them away, 1 here and 1 there and 3 here and 5 there. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, a messenger came to David, and that's what you see in 2 Samuel 15:13. And he said to David, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. What he was really saying was, David, man, it is over. All these people have just flaked out. They've gone away. They're on Absalom's side, and he's announced his plans. He's going to take over. He's going to have this kingdom. And David, all these people who have been with you just aren't there anymore. Now, try to put yourself in David's shoes if you could for a moment. Think about how he would have felt. I mean, how hurt would you be? What would you think about loyalty? What would you think about whatever you had invested? And he had invested his blood and sweat and tears, everything he was, everything he had in this venture from the time he was a young lad. How in the world do you think that he would have felt at that moment in time? Betrayed? How do you think he would have felt about loyalty? Do you think he would have had questions of who in the world can be trusted and who cares anymore? Doesn't anybody have any kind of commitment to a relationship, to a past, to a present? Doesn't anybody care? But there was really nothing he could do, because for all intents and purposes, it looked like Absalom had put together such a huge group of people that they really were going to be able to come in and take over. So David made a decision to leave. He decided that he would get all of those who were loyal to him, who had pledged their allegiance to him and to his kingdom, and he would just flee from Jerusalem. And that's what he did. They took off. Now, it's very interesting, and here's where the plot thickens, and you see this wonderful provision of the Lord. As he was getting ready to go, and as he was counting out all of his people, here a little later in the 15th chapter of 2 Samuel, it tells us in the 18th verse, then all his servants passed before him, all the Cherethites, all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, that is, the people from Gath, Gittites, all the Gittites, 600 men who had followed him from Gath, passed before the king. Now it says, the king said to Ittai the Gittite, why are you also going with us? Return and remain with the king. You're a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today, since I go I know not where? Return and take your brethren back. Mercy and truth be with you. Out of nowhere comes this man named Ittai. He comes from Gath. Remember, Gath is the home of Goliath. The place, he was Goliath of Gath, the place from which Goliath had come originally. It was not obviously a place that was a stronghold of God's people. And not only had Ittai come to join with David, but he had brought 600 of his finest with him. And he had only been there for a day, but he was committed. Now, David gave him every possibility to leave. In fact, he was more than generous. He virtually shoved him out the door. He was kind of like Naomi with Ruth and Orpah. Remember when Naomi said to her daughters-in-law when her sons had died, you don't need to be with me. Just go ahead and go and find husbands and so forth. And Orpah did, but Ruth said, wherever you go, I'll go. Wherever you lodge, I'll lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God, and so forth. No, I'm committed here for the long haul. That is exactly what Ittai did. When David said, listen, you've only been here for a day. You don't owe me anything. Wonderful guy and all these people. Why don't you just stay here or give your allegiance to the new guy or what? Because I don't want to see you get hurt on my account. To that very thing, Ittai said, no, I am here and you can count on me. I want you to understand, I am going to be with you no matter what. In fact, let him speak for himself. He says, as the Lord lives, and as my Lord the King lives, surely in whatever place my Lord the King shall be, whether in death or life, even there your servant will be. David, you can count on me no matter what, because I'm in this thing for the long haul. I'm not going to flake out on you. I'm not going to be a fair weather friend. I'm not going to be here only when it feels good and when some other camp starts up that looks hotter for the moment. I'm not going to go there. David, you have to understand, I am here. You can count on me. And do you know, that affirmation so touched David that it really changed his whole view of what was going to take place. Now, what had happened? God had simply given to David a treasure. Right in the middle of one of the toughest trials he would ever face. And that treasure was in the place of the loyalty of Ittai. In fact, out of this, David would come to make Ittai the leader of a third of his people. And ultimately, as God would deliver him, would flush out the four-flusher, Absalom, the truth about him would come out and all the rest. Ittai would be a very dominant, important part of the kingdom. All because he was willing to trust the Lord and look to the Lord and be used of the Lord to bring the treasure of the Lord to one who was in a tough trial. And David turned his eyes on the Lord and he snapped everything back into focus and trusted God like never before. And God came through. as God had taught Abraham, as God had taught Job, as God had taught Joseph, so would God now teach David that some of his greatest treasures are to be found in the toughest of times. All right, as we just reflect for a minute on this particular lesson, what are some of the things that we learn from it? They're really relatively simple, but you might mark them down. First of all, trials will come, and often when you are most vulnerable. Trials are going to come into your life, and they're often going to come when you're most vulnerable. If you think that the only time that the enemy is going to try to attack you, or the only time that difficulties are going to come into your life is when you're red hot and rolling, when you're strong in the Lord and your faith and you're ready and all the rest, you got another thing coming. Because that just isn't the way it's going to work. You look at David's life. I mean, he didn't know that the confidence in him had been eroded. He didn't know any of that. I mean, he was totally exposed, as it were, to the wolves and to the world, and bang, he gets hit by this out of nowhere. He was absolutely unprepared to have to deal with that. The enemy's not going to come at you hard when you're ready. Usually it's when you're least prepared, least expecting it, and most vulnerable. Look at Luke 4. That passage says it all about the way in which the enemy wants to deal with us in our lives and the difficulties that he would bring. It says in the 4th chapter of Luke, when Satan finished tempting Jesus in the wilderness, and Jesus rebuked him and shoved him away, finally it says in the 13th verse, when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from Jesus. Now look at that last phrase, until an opportune time. He was going to come after him when he was at his weakest point. You're going to face trials. Trials are going to be real in your life, and they're going to happen when you're least ready for them. Now, your natural response is going to be to focus on your trials. Now, that was true for David. David was suddenly immersed with survival and the need just to be able to survive. I mean, he poured all of his energy into flight so that he could avoid fight. Whatever the trial happens to be in your life, understand, when you're up against it, your view is going to be centered on what's right in front of your face. And what's right in front of your face is going to be that problem, or it's going to be directed over your shoulder to see what else is coming down the pipeline to knock you over next. But if there's one thing you're not going to want to do, it's to look up. And in the process, because you don't look up, you miss the provision and the power and the presence of the Lord. But our natural response in any trial is to focus on the trial itself and nothing else. Well, therefore, that brings us to a third principle, and that is when you feel most overwhelmed, it is then that you need to look up rather than down. It is then that you need to focus on the Lord rather than the enemy and whatever else he may or may not be doing, because God is the only one who can make the difference anyway. I think it's so beautiful when you can put all this stuff in context to realize what David actually did when he came up against this very trial. If you look at the 61st Psalm, you will hear his very words. At the height of this problem with Absalom, he looked to the Lord and he said, "Hear my cry, O God, attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth I will cry to you when my heart is overwhelmed. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For you have been a shelter for me and a strong tower from the enemy. I will abide in your tabernacle forever. I will trust in the shelter of your wings." When finally he was at a point of virtually being overwhelmed, David looked up to the Lord. And that is exactly what we've got to do, folks. We've got to turn our gaze heavenward. You know, when you turn your gaze heavenward, and you look up to the Lord, it is then that you will realize that God can be trusted. He has begun a good work in you. He is developing that work in your life right now. He will see it through to completion. When you look up, you realize that God will provide. He has always provided for you, and He has promised that His riches are sufficient to meet any need that you will ever experience. And you can trust in the Lord and in the provision of the Lord. You need to realize that God will vindicate you. Remember what the Lord said through the Apostle Paul in Romans 12? He said, "Repay not evil for evil, for vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." I'll take care of this turkey. Don't you worry about it. I'll take care of him in my time, in my way. He's not going to get away with anything. He may get away with it for a season with people, but he's never gotten away with it with me, and you better count on this now. I'm going to deal with this. And of course, that was something David found to be true, and that is absolutely something that we need to understand. God can be counted on to grow us up through our trials, even when we have blown it. Goodness, David had blown it big time with Bathsheba, and then compounding that by killing her husband, Uriah. But because he repented, because he was faithful to the Lord, God was faithful to him, even to minister to him in that trial, though he had a sordid history. God's grace is real. God's grace can be counted on by His people when they trust Him. Now, there's a fourth principle here, and that is, you need to realize that trusting God is not going to stop the trial. Just because you look to the Lord, just because you trust the Lord, doesn't mean it's all going to come to a quick close, because it doesn't work that way. There are consequences. There are things that unfold. David did have to beat feet out of Jerusalem. He did leave for a good long season, but he trusted the Lord to somehow put it together. In fact, as they were carrying out the Ark of the Covenant, the worship things to be with David, he sent him back into the city and basically said, the Lord's going to take care of this. This is where they belong, and I'll be back here. They don't belong out here with me. You need to understand that when there are trials in your life, just because you trust the Lord, it doesn't mean they're going to come to an immediate end. Part of the reason for that, I'm sure, is because through those trials, it is that God is going to build character in your life. It tells us in Genesis 50 that God takes what the enemy designs for evil and He uses it for our good. It tells us in James 1, it tells us in 1 Peter 1, that God takes the trials in our lives to build patience, to build His personality, to build His character in us. In fact, I have found in my life, for it to be true, that it is the very trials in my life that drive me to my knees. It is the very struggles in my life that snap things back into focus for me, to help me come to understand who God really is and how important He is in my life and how I need to be trusting Him, how I need to be looking to Him. The trials aren't going to cease just because you trust the Lord. But as you trust in the Lord, in the midst of the trials of your life, He will bring to you some of His richest treasures. That's what a man named Horatio Spafford found to be true a number of years ago. Horatio Spafford was a very wealthy attorney in Chicago, even as a young man. Tremendous practice. He built up from the ground up. Did a great job, amassed a fortune, was a very committed Christian. Committed to the Lord, sold out to the Lord, involved with D.L. Moody and evangelistic campaigns and all kinds of things. He made a major investment of almost all of his money in property in downtown Chicago. And shortly after that, the Chicago fire hit, the fire. And it virtually wasted his entire investment. Now you got to understand, this is shortly after he had lost a son. And so these two things together just about wiped him out. He hung on for a couple years, getting things back together again, and finally, as you could imagine, being a bit stressed out, he knew he just needed to unplug for a season. And so he decided that he would go to Europe and help out in a campaign, evangelistic campaign that D.L. Moody was having, and take his family with him. So he booked passage on a ship for himself and his wife and 4 daughters. A couple days before he was to leave, some things happened in business that he had to attend to. He simply couldn't leave when the ship left, but he went ahead and sent his wife and 4 girls on ahead. Some weeks later, he got a cable from England. Turned out that partway out into the ocean, that ship had hit another ship and had sunk. And of the survivors of the ship who finally ended up in England, one of them was his wife, and she sent to him a cable that was simply 2 words: saved alone. And so instantly he realized that not only his son was gone, not only his fortune was gone, but also his 4 daughters were now gone. And so he had his trip all set up. A few days later, had to change it to go to England instead of Europe to meet his wife. And as he was in the midst of the passage on that ship to meet his wife, the captain came down to him in the ship and told him that this was the area in the general vicinity of where the other ship had gone down. And so he surveyed that situation, seeing what it was, realizing what had taken place there. And he went down into the ship, into his room, and he penned some words that would become the verses to a song that would be sung for years to follow and still being sung by Christians everywhere. He said, and you understand the backdrop out of which he was saying this with all of this loss. He said, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well. It is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ hath regarded my helpless estate, and hath shed his own blood for my soul." You know, as powerful as that song is, it is that truth that God wants his people to be able to sing. To understand that in the depth of your trials, God will meet you. And he will more than meet you. He will produce his treasure in your life. But if you're going to experience that, you simply have to trust more in him than you do in the trials and the struggles and the difficulties that besets you. God's grace is more than sufficient for every need that we will ever experience. And he tells us that he will give us of that grace according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus as we look to him.
That was Pastor Bill Ritchie with another sermon from the Radio Ministry Archives here on Brand New Again. We hope you enjoyed going back in time with us for this message, and that you'll keep listening for more great Bible teaching here on Brand New Again.